Have you ever tried to explain an idea, only to realize halfway through that no one is really listening? They furrow their brows, look away, maybe even let out a small, awkward laugh, as if, deep down, they think what you're saying is too far-fetched, too strange, too disconnected from what they know. This pattern has repeated itself throughout human history. First, rejection, then, delayed acceptance. But for those ahead of their time, that gap in between can be lonely and brutal. No one knew this better than Nikola Tesla in the late 19th century. While the world was still adjusting to electricity, he was already talking about a future where energy could be transmitted wirelessly, where machines would communicate over long distances, and where knowledge would be available to anyone, anywhere in the world. Ideas far too advanced for an era that barely understood electric light. The result, he was dismissed, isolated, and died alone in a hotel room. While, decades later, his inventions became the foundation of the modern world. And this tragedy keeps repeating itself. In their lifetimes, great innovators are called lunatics, heretics, fools. Then, when time proves them right, they become geniuses, visionaries, revolutionaries. But why? Why does society, while craving progress, resist so fiercely those who dare to see beyond? The answer isn't just in history. It's wired into the human mind itself. New ideas challenge the predictability that makes us feel safe. The unknown triggers fear. And to stay unified, groups often reject those who think differently. But does that mean isolation is the inevitable fate of those who see beyond? Not necessarily today. We're going to explore the invisible forces that turn brilliance into loneliness, and how to push through that rejection. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that the world may ignore a brilliant idea for a while, but never forever. Society lives in a paradox. It wants progress, but fears innovation. It craves technological advances, new ways of thinking, and discoveries that change the course of history. Yet when those advances appear, the first reaction is almost always resistance. The greatest cultural and scientific revolutions were initially met with skepticism, ridicule, and, often, outright persecution. History is full of examples. When Galileo claimed that the Earth revolved around the sun instead of the other way around, he was condemned by the church and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. When Darwin published his theory of evolution, he was attacked for challenging deeply rooted religious and scientific beliefs. Alan Turing, who laid the groundwork for artificial intelligence, was persecuted, not for his visionary ideas, but because he didn't fit the social norms of his time. This happens because new ideas threaten something fundamental to human psychology. The feeling of security, predictability is comforting. The belief that things have always been a certain way gives us the illusion of control. The unexpected, on the other hand, pulls us out of that comfort zone and forces us to face the fact that the world might not be what we thought. A new idea doesn't just challenge what we know, it also challenges the identity we've built around that knowledge. Accepting a new worldview often means admitting that we were wrong all along. The fear of the unfamiliar isn't just cultural or social. It has biological roots. Our brains weren't designed for sudden change. For thousands of years, humans lived in environments where anything new could mean danger. An unfamiliar animal could be a threat. A new type of food could be poisonous. A stranger could pose a risk. This instinct to be cautious about the unknown has stayed with us. But today, it manifests in more subtle ways. When a new idea emerges, our first instinct isn't to analyze it rationally, but to reject it instinctively. One of the mechanisms that reinforce this rejection is confirmation bias. Our brains seek out information that supports what we already believe and ignore or distort anything that contradicts our convictions. That's why changes in mindset rarely happen overnight. Even when an innovative idea makes sense, it faces resistance because it challenges everything we once believed to be true. And often, the more evidence emerges, the stronger the defensive reaction of those who refuse to accept it. But this resistance isn't limited to groundbreaking scientific discoveries. In everyday life, anyone can experience what it's like to have an idea dismissed simply because it's new. Who hasn't suggested something different at work only to hear an immediate, "that'll never work"? who hasn't tried to change a habit, only to be told they're overreacting, that it's unnecessary. The fear of the new isn't just something found in history books. It's present in family gatherings, conversations with friends, corporate environments, and even on the internet. If you've ever shared an innovative idea and were criticized or ridiculed before anyone even considered it, know that this isn't an automatic judgment of its validity. Many of humanity's greatest changes started exactly this way. Rejection of the new doesn't mean it's wrong. It means it challenges what people have been conditioned to believe, and if history has shown us anything, it's that time has a peculiar way of turning heresies into undeniable truths. Since the beginning of human civilization, one truth has remained constant. Surviving alone is nearly impossible. In the past, being cast out from the tribe meant almost certain death. No protection, no food, no chance of survival. Today, no one needs to hunt or flee from predators, but the instinct to belong is still deeply ingrained. Being accepted by a group remains a fundamental psychological need. The problem is that this instinct comes with a cost: conformity. Those who go along with the group are welcomed. Those who question it are often seen as a problem. This is how herd mentality is born, a psychological and social phenomenon that leads people to follow the collective way of thinking, often without questioning it. The larger the group, the stronger this effect. And it's not because people are naive or easily manipulated, but because our brains prefer the safety of consensus over the uncertainty of independent thought. Truth can be uncomfortable, but social acceptance feels essential. And if there's anything that threatens this acceptance, it's the independent thinker. They challenge norms, ask questions no one wants to answer, and put the group's stability at risk. Socrates was sentenced to death for doing exactly that. He didn't provide ready-made answers. He asked questions that forced others to think. The city of Athens saw him as too dangerous to be left alive. After all, someone who questions the tribe's rules might end up dismantling the very structure that holds everything together. Nietzsche was another classic example. His ideas on morality and power were so unsettling for his time that he was rejected and isolated. During his lifetime, he was dismissed as an eccentric, someone whose words weren't to be taken seriously. Only after his death was his philosophy recognized as one of the most influential in modern thought. And how many times has this happened? Society rejects an innovative idea, ridicules those who defend it, and years later, turns that same idea into a cornerstone of common thinking. The problem is, this kind of exclusion doesn't just happen to great philosophers and scientists. It happens every day, in much smaller ways, in the workplace, in social circles, on the internet. Those who think differently can be labeled as difficult, problematic, or extreme, and often, rejection doesn't come in the form of open hostility. It comes in silence, in subtle looks, in a quiet disconnect that makes it clear that a certain way of thinking isn't welcome. The internet has amplified this phenomenon. In the past, groupthink was mostly confined to local communities. Today, it spreads on a global scale. Social media has created echo chambers, where people interact only with those who already agree with them. This reinforces the illusion that the dominant way of thinking is absolute, and any deviation from it is seen as a threat. Those who question too much risk being isolated, ridiculed, or even canceled, not because they're wrong, but because they disrupt the group's stability. And this raises an important question. Despite all the knowledge and technology we have, are we still making the same mistakes? Are we still excluding those who think differently? Just like Athens condemned Socrates, or the scientific community ridiculed Darwin. Looking at history, the answer seems to be yes. But if we look at the impact these thinkers had on the world, we realize that rejection isn't the end. More often than not, it's a sign that an idea is far ahead of its time. A group may try to silence an independent thinker, but they can't do it forever. In the end, it's always independent thinking that pushes the world forward. What makes someone reject an innovative idea? Fear? Discomfort? Sometimes, yes. But there's another factor that rarely gets discussed. Ego. Because accepting a new worldview doesn't just require curiosity. It requires humility. It means admitting that everything we've always believed might be wrong. And that's never easy. When someone brings a revolutionary idea, they're not just presenting something new. They're exposing the limitations of conventional thinking, and for many people, that exposure is uncomfortable. They don't reject the idea itself. They reject what it represents, the need to rethink their certainties. That's where ego comes into play. Instead of considering that they might be wrong, many people would rather dismiss the person who dared to question them. This phenomenon appears in different ways. One of them is the Dunning-Kruger effect, a cognitive bias where people with little knowledge of a subject tend to overestimate their own understanding. This means that the less someone knows, the more confident they are that they're right. On the other hand, the more someone truly understands a topic, the more they recognize its complexity. And so, they approach it with more caution. The result, less informed people often react with arrogance and hostility to ideas they don't fully understand. History is full of examples. Van Gogh was rejected because his art didn't make sense to people at the time. His vibrant colors and intense brushstrokes seemed too chaotic for a world used to soft, realistic paintings. It was only after his death that people realized what he had created. In his lifetime, he was seen as strange, eccentric, out of place. Decades later, his works became some of the most valuable in the world. But this kind of rejection doesn't only happen to artists and scientists, it happens every day. In casual conversations, workplace meetings, and online debates, anyone who has ever tried to introduce a new idea in a conservative environment knows exactly what this means. Often, the criticism isn't because the idea is bad, but because it threatens the status quo, and that leads to an important reflection. If the geniuses of the past had given up after the first rejection, would we have the works and discoveries that shaped our civilization? What if Van Gogh had stopped painting? What if Einstein had given up on physics after being seen as a failure in school? What if every independent thinker had simply surrendered to the dominant mindset? Ego may resist the new, but time has a peculiar way of making it inevitable. Thinking differently comes at a cost. Intellectual solitude can be one of the biggest challenges for those who see beyond the ordinary. Being rejected not just by those who disagree, but by those who don't even try to understand, can be a heavy burden. But history shows that rejection is often not an ending. It's a test, and those who persist, despite the isolation, end up shaping the world in ways no one could have predicted. The pain of rejection can be brutal. Many of humanity's greatest thinkers suffered not just from dismissal, but from the feeling that they were shouting into the void. Tesla died forgotten. Van Gogh sold only one painting in his lifetime. Emily Dickinson wrote hundreds of poems that were only recognized after her death. Genius is often accompanied by involuntary exile, and that raises the question: what makes some of these brilliant minds persist? How do they endure the constant feeling of being on the margins, of having their ideas seen as irrelevant or absurd? This is where the difference lies between being rejected and being defeated. Rejection is an inevitable obstacle, but defeat only happens when you give up. Resilience doesn't come from the world's acceptance. It comes from accepting yourself. Those who think differently must find ways to hold on to their ideas without depending on external validation. Some strategies can make all the difference. First, seeking out communities that value the unique way each person sees the world. These people may not always be nearby, but with time, they appear. Second, using rejection as fuel. When a disruptive thinker is ignored, it often means they are exploring a territory no one has yet had the courage to step into. And third, learning to communicate ideas in a more accessible way. Many of history's greatest innovators weren't rejected because they were wrong, but because they couldn't translate their vision to those still trapped in the past. Albert Einstein is a clear example of resilience. Considered a failure in school, he struggled to find an academic job. If he had given up, he would never have published his theory of relativity, which redefined modern physics. What sustained him wasn't immediate acceptance from the world, but the conviction that his ideas had value, even when no one else understood them at the time. The world often rejects what it doesn't understand, until the day it desperately needs it. And when that day comes, what was once ignored becomes indispensable. Thinking differently is not just an act of intelligence, but a test of endurance. There are no guarantees of recognition, no paths already paved. Those who dare to challenge the norm often find themselves alone, carrying the weight of rejection and the silence of those who prefer the comfort of what they already know. The world fears the new because it destabilizes what is established, threatens built-up certainties, and challenges what once seemed absolute. But history proves, time and again, that it is precisely this disruption that propels humanity forward. What is unquestionable today was once considered heresy. The truths that sustain our society exist only because someone, at some point, was strong enough to uphold them when no one else would. Every intellectual revolution began in the mind of someone who did not find immediate acceptance. The discoveries that shaped the world were not received with applause, but with resistance, fear, and often hostility. When Galileo pointed his telescope at the sky and saw that the Earth was not the center of the universe, he did not find admiration, he found imprisonment. When Darwin revealed that living beings evolve, he was treated as a heretic. When Van Gogh painted with colors and brushstrokes that defied the standard, his work was ignored. The pattern repeats. Genius is born in isolation, grows in struggle, and only later flourishes in recognition. But what if all these thinkers had given up? What if they had allowed rejection to crush their conviction? How many brilliant ideas have been lost because those who created them did not have the strength to sustain them? If there is one thing that defines the great innovators, it is not just genius, but the courage to keep going, even when the world refuses to understand. It does not matter whether we are talking about science, art, philosophy, or even how we see our own lives. The comfort of acceptance is tempting. But true transformation is born from resistance. Many of those who are rejected today will be celebrated tomorrow. But what separates those who leave their mark from those who disappear into oblivion is not just talent, it is persistence. And that leads to an essential question. How many times have you stayed silent out of fear of rejection? How many ideas have you abandoned because the world did not seem ready for them? If history teaches us anything, it is that rejection is never the final chapter. The world can try to ignore an idea, but it can never prevent it from existing. If there is a voice inside you saying that there is something more, something different, something that has not yet been said or understood, that voice deserves to be heard. Because what is seen as madness today may one day be recognized as genius. If you have ever felt the weight of being misunderstood, know that it does not mean you are wrong. Maybe it just means you are ahead. And if there is one thing that must not be done, it is giving up. Keep going, even if it feels lonely, even if acceptance does not come now. Because one day, what seems strange today will be the new normal. And when that day comes, it will be those who did not give up who will have changed the world. If this message resonated with you, thank you. Thank you for being here, for allowing this conversation to exist, for refusing to settle for the obvious. If you have ever been rejected for thinking differently, I want to hear your story. Leave a comment and share your experience. This does not have to be a lonely fight. Let's continue this conversation together. And if this message made sense to you, share it with someone who also needs to hear it. Keep following this channel for more reflections that challenge conventional thinking, because the world may try to ignore a brilliant idea, but it can never erase it completely. See you in the next video.